The British justice system is the envy of the world. But in the past, mistakes have been made.
Over the last 150 years, approximately 1,500 people have been hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these long-standing convictions could be a miscarriage of justice.
The evidence is so overwhelming that they have to tell the truth.
In this series, a living relative will attempt to clear their family name.
Everywhere you look, to me, there are elements of doubt.
Searching for new evidence.
But once he'd got the money, I'm not quite sure what the benefit of her death was to him.
With help from two of the UK's leading barristers, one for the defence.
There is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
And one for the prosecution.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
They're on a mission to solve a mystery, submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Thank you both for your submissions. I shall consider these matters for myself.
Can this modern investigation rewrite history? On the 12th of April 1877, a desperately frail woman was taken on an arduous journey from rural Kent to Penge, on the outskirts of southeast London. That woman was 36-year-old wealthy heiress Harriet Staunton. Moaning and barely conscious, she had to be carried the final stretch to her lodging house. Medical help was sought, but it was too late. And by the following afternoon, Harriet was dead. Her body was found to be in an emaciated state, filthy and riddled with lice. Suspicion for causing her death by starvation and neglect soon fell on her husband, 26-year-old auctioneer Louis Staunton. He was charged along with 3 other people: his brother Patrick, Patrick's wife Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's sister Alice Rhodes. The 4 stood trial for willful murder at London's Old Bailey and desperately pleaded their innocence. But after 7 days, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, and Louis Staunton and his 3 family members were sentenced to death. But the story didn't end there. Now, 2 generations on, Louis Staunton's grandson Nigel is seeking justice.
This is a picture of Harriet Staunton, released at the time of the trial. A sad picture. She does not look a happy person.
Nigel only found out about the case in 2005.
I decided to make the research one of my great interests because I just wanted to know more. As soon as I read the trial, I personally wasn't happy with it. Everywhere you look, to me, there are elements of doubt. This shows Louis with Alice in a photograph which presumably they never ever knew was going to be released in hundreds or thousands around the time of the trial. I'm a quarter Louis Staunton. This is my grandfather. And to me, that is important. So anything that came out of this that perhaps showed his innocence would please me no end.
The trial of Louis Staunton attracted huge public attention and relied upon contentious medical evidence. But was it a miscarriage of justice? And can a modern-day legal investigation bring anything new to bear on this Victorian-era conviction? Jeremy Dean QC was called to the bar in 1982 and is one of the country's leading defence barristers. Sasha Was QC has successfully prosecuted some of the UK's most notorious criminals. Nigel has travelled to London to meet the barristers.
Hello, Nigel.
Hello.
Jeremy.
Nigel, Sasha.
Hi, Sasha.
We know that you have a profound interest in the case. What are the things that strike you as being the most significant?
I don't think the judge did a good job. He was an ex-prosecutor, which was, I think, his first big case afterwards. And I actually believe he acted a bit like a prosecutor throughout the trial, rather than, as I believe, a judge should be impartial.
Rather than an umpire, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I believe that you're concerned about the quality of the medical evidence in the case?
Yes, I am. There was a lot published about the autopsy afterwards. They felt the medical evidence was unsafe. People
are very rude about Louis and his attitude towards Harriet, and I make no excuses for him, and he made no excuses about the fact that he neglected her. He admitted it, but I honestly don't believe that he actually set out to murder her.
Well, Jeremy and I will go away. We've got a lot of work to do, and we will come back, hopefully, with some news.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Louis Staunton was born in 1851 in Camberwell in South London, the fourth son of a glue manufacturer. In 1874, he met and the following year married Harriet, who was 10 years his senior and extremely wealthy, having inherited a considerable fortune. Did Louis marry and then murder Harriet for her money? The barristers begin their investigation by examining the facts of the case and the complex family dynamics.
Harriet Staunton married Louis Staunton. Very soon, Harriet fell pregnant, and during the course of her pregnancy, it appeared that Louis started having an affair with a woman called Alice Rhodes. Alice Rhodes was, in fact, the sister of Elizabeth Staunton, who was married to Patrick Staunton, who was the brother of Louis Staunton. Now, Harriet's baby, Thomas, was born in 1876, and the baby was sent to Kent to live with Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton. And very soon after that, Harriet joined the Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton household. She had no communication with her mother and no communication with any other member of the family. At the same time, her husband, Louis, set up home with Alice Rhodes. So we have quite a complicated domestic situation. It was alleged by the prosecution at trial that Harriet was neglected, abused and starved by the Stauntons. On the 8th of April, 1877, baby Thomas was taken ill. He went to Guy's Hospital where he died. And on the 12th of April, so only 4 days later, Harriet's condition deteriorated so that she was moved from the Staunton house to lodging in Forbes Road in Penge, where on the 13th of April, 1877, she died.
Sasha, it was the prosecution case that Harriet Staunton died of starvation and neglect. But I'd like to look at cause of death, and in particular to see what a modern-day pathologist makes of the circumstances in which Harriet Staunton died.
The other aspect that I think is worth looking at is the financial aspect, because we know that Harriet had a considerable sum of money. I want to know what, if any, benefit any of the defendants would have had from her death. So I think a forensic accountant might be able to shed some light on
Well, I think that sounds very sensible.
By 1877, Harriet Staunton was living apart from her husband, Louis, in a secluded house in the rural Kent village of Cudham with Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton. She had effectively disappeared from the outside world. Even her mother didn't know where she was and became increasingly concerned about her welfare. On the 8th of April 1877, her son Thomas tragically died. His cause of death was said to be convulsions and wasn't investigated further. By the 12th of April, Harriet herself weighed less than 6 stone, and Louis and Elizabeth went to Penge on the outskirts of southeast London to find lodgings for her. They claimed it was to get her closer to medical help. Following in the footsteps of his grandfather, Nigel has come to Penge.
Chris.
He's meeting with local researcher Chris O'Shaughnessy. Did the events that unfolded here implicate his grandfather in murder?
We've come to stand opposite the house where Harriet Staunton died.
That's amazing.
On the evening of the 12th of April, Louis, Elizabeth and Patrick Staunton and Alice Rhodes moved Harriet with great difficulty by wagon and then train to Penge.
So they arrived at Penn Station and they had to get Harriet, who was comatose almost, off the train, and there was a cab there. And as Harriet was being put aboard, she moaned So the driver changed his mind about driving her because of the unmade road. They were first built houses, just been there 4 or 5 years. So the driver and Patrick carried Harriet around the corner to this house.
The local GP, Dr. Longrig, was sought, but he was unable to see Harriet until the following day. When he arrived, he found her in a desperate condition, and at 1:30 p.m, Harriet died.
He registered her death causes as cerebral disease and apoplexy, which could mean a stroke or heart attack. When the nurse laid her out, the nurse was surprised at how emaciated Harriet was, and that she was covered with lice, 2 layers of hair. She had a real hair and false hair, and she had great difficulty removing the false hair because the lice were like almost impregnated in her scalp. Her skin looked like the bark of a tree, and the dirt was so embedded she couldn't clean the body as she had wished.
Louis went to a local shop to make inquiries about registering his wife's death. But by a remarkable coincidence, he was overheard by a Mr. Casabianca, the husband of Harriet's sister. Mr. Casabianca recognized the description of Harriet.
Up to that point, Harriet had just disappeared. They'd lost trace of her. And he decided to make some inquiries, and he sought out the local doctor, who turned out to be Dr. Longrig, and Casabianca saw Harriet and identified Harriet. Dr. Longrig, as a result of that identification, decided to withdraw his original certificate and diagnosis of death.
At that stage, the police were alerted and began their inquiries into what was now considered a suspicious death.
This is somewhere where something sad happened, which was my grandfather's wife died in this house. For whatever the reason she died here. So that has a certain impact on me.
Harriet Staunton was born into a wealthy family in South London in 1841. She struggled with education, but was said to have been fond of clothes and took pride in her appearance. When Louis began to show an interest in Harriet in 1874, her mother, Mrs. Butterfield, was horrified, appearing to believe he was only after her money. She unsuccessfully tried to have Harriet declared a lunatic to prevent their marriage, and the mother-daughter relationship took a downturn. Were Mrs. Butterfield's concerns for her daughter well-founded? Jeremy and Sasha want to examine the chain of events that led up to Harriet's death.
So Louis and Harriet married in June 1875, and they lived in Brixton. At one stage, Mrs. Butterfield, Harriet's mother, visited her. She then received a letter objecting to her calling on them at the address in Brixton.
This was the last time that Mrs. Butterfield saw her daughter alive.
Harriet had her son Thomas in March 1876, and when the baby was under 6 months old, Thomas was sent to live with Elizabeth and Patrick in Cudham. Harriet followed, and Louis was paying Patrick and Elizabeth £1 a week to look after her.
Nigel and Chris have come to Cudham, to the Blacksmith's Arms, a favourite drinking spot of Louis and Patrick Staunton.
Right. My grandfather and my granduncle, I suppose technically.
Yes.
Here, drinking here. The mind boggles, it really does.
They're keen to explore the unusual living arrangements of the Staunton family.
How did they end up in Cudham? Well, Alice came to live with Harriet and Louis in Brixton.
That's right.
And set up a very curious menage a trois.
As I understand it, Harriet became unhappy. She could clearly see this attraction between Louis, and Alice.
Harriet had a baby, Thomas.
She was struggling with the baby.
She was struggling, yeah. She may not have been capable. I mean, her mother called her simple-minded. So this is the photograph of Woodlands, which was the house just down the road from here, where Harriet went to live with Elizabeth and Patrick and Harriet's baby. And this next one is a photograph of Little Gray's farm, Cudham, which was the place where Alice and Louis came to live and set up home together. For all intents and purposes, any local person would have understood Alice as Mrs.
Just assumed that she was Mrs. Staunton.
Yeah.
But how did these unusual family dynamics result in Harriet's death?
Between October 76 and April 77, Harriet was confined to the Woodlands with Patrick and Elizabeth, and their servant was Clara Brown. And Clara Brown said that really from then on, from the time that Harriet moved in, she was a prisoner and abused, and that Patrick forbade Harriet to be visited by anyone, and on one occasion, according to Clara, Patrick struck Harriet and wasn't allowing her to eat with the family. So we have the pattern of abuse developing.
Well, Sasha, that's from a prosecution perspective. The alternative approach was the one that the defendants put forward at trial. They claimed that Harriet was in fact an alcoholic, that her emaciated state was due to the fact that she refused to eat food. Her preoccupation was with alcohol. And also that Harriet was violent to them and also to her own mother. So not the sort of weakling that the prosecution made her out to be.
We mustn't forget that it may well have been the case that Harriet was alcoholic or that she was mentally disordered. But the people who were granted the task to care for her, Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton, seem not to have done so.
Harriet had a cash inheritance in the region of £250,000 in today's money from her late aunt, Lady Eleanor Rivers. But did Louis have a financial motive to kill Harriet? Jeremy and Sasha are meeting with forensic accountant Chris Swinson.
So on marriage, Louis had all of the inheritance because, of course, 1875 was prior to the Married Woman's Property Act.
Yes.
And a married woman simply was not allowed to own property in that era.
Exactly.
Harriet had inherited further wealth in the form of reversionary interest, which was like holding the temporary lease of a property and did not automatically pass to Louis when they married. However, just months before her death, Harriet sold off her reversionary interest.
Had Harriet died without disposing of the reversionary interest, what would have happened to that financial interest as far as Louis was concerned?
The interest would disappear because it would then move on to somebody else.
And in real terms, that would mean that Louis did not receive the money.
Exactly.
Right. The result of the disposal meant that Louis now had the proceeds of the reversionary interest.
He received £1,100.
Which I think in those days was a lot of money.
You get £120,000 in current values, which is a significant sum now.
It is.
Did Louis Staunton have an interest in Harriet Staunton dying?
Well, once he'd got the money, I'm not quite sure what the benefit of her death was to him. He certainly had an interest in getting her money before her death.
Harriet sold her reversionary interest. Whether that transaction gave Louis a motive or an additional motive to dispose of his wife is not clear, because once the property was under Louis's control, he had no possible reason to benefit from her death.
Louis Staunton's trial was held in the middle of Queen Victoria's reign, a period usually associated with strict moral standards and traditional family values. Yet Louis Staunton had been living apart from his wife and child with another woman, Alice Rhodes. Nigel wants to know how his grandfather's behaviour might have been viewed at the time.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Nigel.
Hi, Nigel. I'm Jade. Nice to meet you.
He's meeting with social historian Dr. Jade Shepherd.
I'm interested to know what Victorian attitude towards unfaithfulness was.
A good Victorian husband would live with his wife. He would provide for his wife. He would protect his wife. And he wouldn't try and hide his marriage from his neighbours.
Would this have really affected the jury's attitude, do you think?
In such cases, a jury's verdict tells us a lot more about Victorian society, perhaps,
about the jury themselves, yeah, maybe.
I think opinion towards him would have been quite negative, and he would have been viewed as a husband who had neglected his wife. Yeah. And he had sent her to live with a family who at best were indifferent towards her and at worst neglected her.
It makes you wonder whether Louis ever stood a chance of getting a fair trial. Just attitudes that people had during the Victorian era.
The trial of Louis Staunton and his 3 co-accused began at the Old Bailey on the 19th of September 1877, before Justice Henry Hawkins. The proceedings featured disagreement over the medical evidence, with the prosecution asserting Harriet had been murdered by deliberate starvation, but the defence claiming she had in fact died from TB and other natural causes. But does either interpretation stand up to modern-day scrutiny? Sasha and Jeremy are meeting with Professor of Forensic Medical Sciences, Peter Venezes.
Can you tell us what the significant autopsy findings were in the case of Harriet Staunton?
They found a small area in her lung, which was a previous TB infection. Then they found some small nodules in the brain, so they were of the view that she'd had cerebral tuberculosis. She was also very emaciated, lice-infected. She was generally dirty.
Do you agree, based on what you've seen, that Harriet Staunton might have died from starvation?
Yes, I do, yes. Starvation can actually be a cause of death, but it can also be the mechanism by which someone has died. For example, they cannot get food into their body for whatever reason. This is what TB was associated with. Therefore, we have terms like consumption, which have been used in the past.
Have you been able to identify anything in the evidence given by prosecution experts that militated more in favour of murder, of systematic starvation, than the ordinary developing of TB or of Harriet Staunton having simply starved herself?
No, I haven't found anything.
The evidence in the case is that Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton were paid by Louis Staunton the sum of £1 a week to look after Harriet. And if that was their responsibility, it did not appear, did it, that they had done a proper job?
Hypothetically, if somebody is in your care,
yes,
then for whatever reason becoming emaciated and there's not much you can do about it, you would alert the authorities to this.
But of course here we have not only the emaciation, but we have the signs of neglect, the lice, the dirty personal hygiene. There is, on the face of it, a clear case of neglect here.
Yes, indeed.
Forget murder or whatever.
Yes, indeed.
But when Sasha says forget murder, in fact, we need to remember murder, because murder is the offence of which they were convicted. And you're not able, as a pathologist, to detect the factual circumstances in which Harriet Staunton ended up in the medical condition she is, are you?
No, no.
Professor Venezis recognised the probability that Harriet Staunton died of starvation, but also acknowledges that TB could have caused starvation.
Nigel has come to Sevenoaks Library in Kent to explore some of the press coverage of Louis Staunton's trial. The trial attracted huge media attention, making the front pages of national newspapers.
This is the illustrated police news of the dreadful murder at Penge, and talk about dramatic illustrations showing the cruel treatment, showing Patrick hitting Harriet. I won't make any judgments as to how true some of these images might be, but they are clearly based on an artist's impression. This is the Leeds Mercury. You get some idea of the whole atmosphere of this court. During the 6 days of the case, there were ladies present in the courtroom, complete with opera glasses and glasses of champagne. Clearly, it was a spectacle worth going to. The result of the deliberations of the jury was awaited with breathless anxiety. The clerk asked the foreman, "Did you find Louis Adolphus Edward Staunton guilty of the murder of which he stands indicted?" "We find him guilty." And they then went through, all 4 of them, basically with exactly the same reaction. Then the judge, he's frankly, to my opinion, very outspoken. Says like they've been found guilty by the jury of a crime so black and hideous that I would believe in all the records of crime it would be difficult to find its parallel. It remains only for me to pass upon you the sentence of law. You each be hanged by the neck until you be dead, and may the Lord have mercy on your souls. Louis Staunton preserved the same unmoved and stolid demeanour he had maintained throughout, but Patrick seemed much moved and the women sobbed violently. Outside for hours, there'd been a noisy mob in Newgate Street, and just as the prisoners were taken from the dock the news of their fates having been received, there was considerable cheering which rang through the 3 open doors of the court and must have been heard by the prisoners. How would my grandfather have reacted to all this? I mean, according to the description, he appears unmoved. I'd like to think that maybe he was just totally shell-shocked and, you know, he did not believe he was guilty, and I feel for him.
A key witness at the trial was the servant of Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton, Clara Brown. Jeremy has found major discrepancies in her evidence. Could these reveal who was really responsible for Harriet's death?
Clara Brown was 16 years old, in my view, too vulnerable to give evidence in a case of this nature. And that is exemplified by the quality of her evidence. At the coroner's court, she effectively supported the defence account. She did not describe Harriet Staunton as abused or victim of violence or starvation in any way, shape or form. But then when she gave evidence at trial, she fundamentally supported the prosecution case. Apparently she turned up dressed for trial as if she was going to a wedding, and there's a suspicion of her having been coached by the police. In particular, she gave evidence that Patrick Staunton spoke angrily to Harriet, that she saw him strike a blow to Harriet, that she became increasingly weak and was denied access to food. But the evidence of Clara Brown was totally and utterly inconsistent and arguably untruthful. She was a worthless witness.
Well, Jeremy, we've got to bear in mind that Clara Brown was not just a servant. She was, in fact, the first cousin of Elizabeth Staunton. She would have had loyalty. Clara said, when she gave her account at trial, that the reason she had lied was because Patrick threatened her. Of course, any witness who changes their account is open to attacks on their credibility. But we have here a very young girl, and I can see how it could have happened that she gave untrue evidence to support their case, having been pressurised to do so.
On any view, there was a radical shift in the testimony she gave. However, it seems to me that the key point is that Clara Brown gave no evidence at either the coroner's inquiry or the trial which implicated Louis Staunton in the murder of Harriet Staunton.
The really important evidence in this case is evidence of the person who had custody and control of Harriet at the time of her death, namely Elizabeth and Patrick Staunton.
Yeah.
Nigel has come to Maidstone Prison to meet one of the governors, David Sargent.
Good afternoon, Nigel. Nice to meet you.
After the death sentence was handed down to Louis Staunton and his 3 co-accused at the trial, they were transferred to the jail, where their executions were due to take place within 3 weeks.
So this is one of the original cells in Kent Wing from 1850. And as you can see, the building itself is broadly what was in the day.
It really does convey something to me, actually. It could well have been one of them in here.
Yes, this could have been where your grandfather was held.
Whilst the 4 were awaiting their execution date at the prison, public dissatisfaction was growing over their harsh sentences. 700 doctors signed a letter to the Home Secretary protesting about the medical evidence in the case, and this was also published in the Lancet. As a result of the outrage, the Home Secretary reopened the case, and at the last minute, there was some life-saving news.
So, on the 14th of October, 2 days before their execution date, the Home Secretary issued a notice giving them respite from their death penalty. I've got an article here, Nigel, which describes the moment that Louis was told. The first news of the respite of the convicts reached the Governor of Maidstone Jail a few minutes before 7. The first to receive the news were the female prisoners, and Mrs. Patrick Staunton, upon being informed that her sentence was remitted, was quite overcome. She burst into tears and was, for some minutes, unable to speak. Eventually, she gratefully expressed her thanks to the Governor. The next to hear the news was Alice Rhodes, and she, like her sister, exhibited great emotion. The Governor then proceeded to the cells in which the male convicts were confined, and upon imparting the news to Louis Staunton, The latter seemed quite stunned for a few moments. He repeated the words respite several times, and then when he came to receive the meaning, said in a very low tone of voice, "Thank you, sir." It is amazing, isn't it, that this article conveys the mood of the moment.
Which obviously was such a strong emotion,
yes,
for all four involved to have it, because they clearly didn't expect it.
No, they clearly didn't expect to get the reprieve that they got.
They thought they were 2 days away or so from
the gallows.
From
dying. Fascinating. Fascinating.
Mind-boggling.
Yes.
Yeah, particularly standing here, it's mind-boggling. Yeah.
Trying to get your head around that.
Yeah.
Experienced it.
Yeah. Can't stop thinking about it.
No.
The thinking that it was only 2 days before the sentence was due to be carried out, the hanging of my grandfather and the 3 others, to only learn that 2 days before really makes you think about how the stress and strain must have built up during that time. It must have been an amazing happening for them.
A fortnight after their executions were put on pause, Louis, Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment, whilst Alice Rhodes was given a pardon and released with immediate effect. But why did Alice go free, whilst Louis faced a life of incarceration? Jeremy has been delving further into the trial and has cause for concern.
Sasha, the judge spent, it seems, 10.5 hours summing the case up. It's documented in really vivid terms in Edward Clarke's book, and he was the defence counsel for Patrick Staunton.
Mm-hmm.
It's described how the judge placed constant emphasis upon the facts told against the prisoners, and how every point made in their favour was turned aside as being of no importance. He barely gave the jury a break during the summing up, and that was the context in which verdicts of guilty were returned. Absolutely extraordinary. The jury retired at about 10 o'clock at night.
The transcript we have of the summing up runs to 42 pages, and less than 1 page dealt with the very important medical evidence in this case. So the chances of the jury actually being able to digest all of this material, I would have thought were quite slender.
They were probably more preoccupied with going to bed than reaching just verdicts. So, Sasha, for me, in Louis Staunton's case, the evidence wasn't there, the trial was unfair, the summing up was abysmal. The Home Secretary looked at the case again. He pardoned Alice Rhodes, who lived with Louis Staunton at the time. It's just pure pandemonium.
Louis Staunton died in 1934, aged 83. And Nigel has come to the cemetery where his grandfather is buried. Louis spent 20 years of his life in prison for the murder of Harriet Staunton before his eventual release on licence in 1897.
After Louis left prison, he lived with Alice. Alice unfortunately died in 1914. And a couple of years later, Louis married the lady who was to be my grandmother. To start with, she was a housekeeper for him, but then they got married and lived until Louis' death, right until 1934. In that time, he had many children. Obviously, my mother was one of those children. And without that happening, I wouldn't be here. Even though he went on to live a fruitful life with his new family, he clearly must have still had it hanging over him that he was a convicted murderer, which I think is sad, because I do not believe he was.
The barristers have completed their investigation and must now present their findings to Judge David Radford.
I'll be concentrating on the absence of evidence and the judge's conduct or misconduct, depending on how you view it. The case for willful murder just isn't there.
I have very serious concerns about the safety of the conviction of Louis Staunton, but that doesn't mean Judge Radford will necessarily share my concerns.
For Nigel, today could finally be an opportunity to clear his grandfather's name, nearly 150 years after he was convicted of murder.
This is the culmination of 14 years of research, and it comes to today, so it would clearly be important to the whole family to find out that it was an unsafe verdict.
Nigel.
Sasha, hello.
Lovely to see you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
So how are you feeling?
I'm hoping it's going to come out as an unsafe verdict. I personally believe that,
Yes.
but let's see what happens.
The judge is working on the case now. He's very thorough, so let's head in his direction.
Correct.
After you.
Thank you.
With over 14 years' experience as a senior Crown Court judge, David Radford has presided over some of the UK's most infamous trials. And he'll be treating this case like any other.
Please take a seat. We are here today for me to consider the safety of the conviction of Louis Staunton of the offence of murder of his wife, Harriet. Can I now turn to you, please, first of all, Mr. Dean, for your submissions?
It's my submission that Your Honour should regard Louis Staunton's conviction as unsafe for three compelling reasons in this most tragic case. First, that there is simply no evidence that Louis Staunton was involved in the willful murder of Harriet Staunton, because there are two ways of looking at Clara Brown's evidence. One is that she was a lying witness, but the other way of looking at her evidence, that whether truthful or untruthful, Clara Brown did not implicate Louis Staunton in willful murder. Now, the second ground upon which I rely relates to the judge's conduct of the trial, which, in my submission, was quite extraordinary, unacceptable, and highly prejudicial to Louis Staunton. In that, the judge summed the case up for no less than 10.5 hours. Mr. Clark, who represented Patrick Staunton at trial, says in vivid terms that only a wicked judge would have sent a jury at nearly 10 o'clock at night, exhausted to consider a verdict involving the lives of 4 human beings whose cases required separate consideration. And it was in those circumstances that Louis Staunton was found guilty. And third, and I have very serious criticism of the summing up indeed, he did not define the ingredients of the offence of murder. And the judge gave no direction to consider the cases of each of the defendants separately. So they were all lumped together, and he did not deal properly or in any comprehensible way with the medical evidence. I submit that Louis Staunton's conviction is unquestionably unsafe, and that is the view Your Honour ought to express.
Thank you. Well, Miss Voss, how do you respond?
Your Honour, Louis Staunton married his wife Harriet in 1875. By October of 1876, he had tired of her, and he set up home with Alice Rhodes. By the time of Harriet's death on the 13th of April, 1877, Harriet displayed signs of chronic neglect. She weighed just over 5 stone. She had lice. She was living in her own filth. Mr. Dean and I met with Professor Peter Venezes, a modern-day pathologist. He made it plain that starvation appears to be the likely cause of death. He commented that it was right to say there were signs of tuberculosis. The obvious inference is that Harriet had been neglected, either by failing to feed her, certainly by failing to care for her, and by failing to treat her had she been ill. And Clara Brown's evidence was that Harriet had been subjected to a campaign of neglect and ill treatment. But as Mr. Dean has properly pointed out, Clara Brown makes absolutely no reference whatsoever to any ill treatment on the part of Louis Staunton. Mr. Dean has drawn your attention to parts of the summing up, and I entirely endorse his criticisms of the trial judge. Louis Staunton may have been an unattractive character for the way in which he left Harriet for another woman and simply left her to be looked after by others, paying the money and not really giving much attention to her treatment. But that is not a criminal offence, and I entirely support what Mr. Dean has said, that there was no evidence whatsoever to convict Louis Staunton of murder in this case.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Ross. Well, I'll reflect on those submissions, and in due course, I'll let you know my decision. Would you be kind enough to allow me time to do that?
Certainly. Off to you. Nigel, we've been in to see the judge. You've heard my submissions. What's your reaction?
I think I agreed with everything you said, and I was delighted to hear what you're saying, and also to hear that Sasha eventually sort of came round to the same way of thinking as I have.
Nigel, I ought to say that just because Jeremy and I agree in this case, it doesn't necessarily mean that the judge will take his lead from us. He's an independently minded person and will come to his own conclusions, all right? Well, I think we're being called back into the judge's room, so follow me.
OK.
Did Louis Staunton murder his wife by starvation and neglect? Or was he the victim of Victorian social attitudes and subjected to an unfair trial? The judge is now ready to deliver his verdict.
Ms. Ross has properly referred to the cogent evidence of the appalling neglect of Harriet, so patently seen in her physical condition, time of her death and prior to it. This was a challenging case for a judge to have to try as his first murder case. With respect, the trial judge failed utterly to meet that challenge. He failed to direct the jury correctly. He failed to marshal a coherent, succinct and helpful summary of the medical issues. He failed, too, to distinguish between and separately sum up the 4 different cases appertaining to the 4 separate defendants. That would, in my view, have certainly revealed the paucity of any direct evidence of participation by Louis Staunton in his wife's neglect. Having considered for myself all of the helpful submissions put before me and all of the papers in this case, I have no doubt whatsoever that a verdict of guilty of murder of Louis Staunton was an unsafe one. I shall rise.
Very pleased for you.
Thank you for your help, and thank you,
Well done,
Jesse.
Nigel.
That was great.
Well, Nigel, you've now heard the judge declare in the strongest possible terms. He's been absolutely clear that he regards your grandfather's conviction as unsafe on a number of grounds.
I've believed it myself for a long time.
Yeah.
But to actually have it backed up by the legal establishment, if you like, now is brilliant.
All the best for the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy.
Bye-bye,
Thank you,
Nigel.
Sasha.
Bye.
That's great. I'm feeling absolutely fantastic. The rest of the family can know that their grandfather was not a murderer, and that is so important.